The tradition of monumental landscape had begun during the 5 dynasties. So after the fall of Tang Dynasty, people like Jing Hao and other scholars, they got so disappointed. Yeah, and then they feel so frustrated because they studied so hard, but there is no empire or kingdom to serve. There are nomads coming in, and they are usually chased by those invaders because they once served the Tang Dynasty. So Chinese people or intellectuals migrated to the countryside to avoid those tumultuous fights in the city. So the painter named Jing Hao painted Mount Guanglu. And this is a hanging scroll from the top and the bottom. But what you are looking at, you can really imagine the size, but you should imagine that this is more than 6 feet tall. So if you stand in front of it, it is quite powerful and overwhelming to you. So it's not quite the size of the mountain, but when you stand up here, you do feel like, wow, this is really huge, you know, and then sort of your mind will travel along this path in the middle of the mountains. And you walk and walk for days, and you can never reach the peak of it because it's endless. How do you know that it's endless? Because like a small, you know, more peaks are hidden under the mist all the way in the back. Usually in this kind of monumental landscape, you have a foreground. Foreground is here. You have sort of a middle ground, and then you have a far distance. But in this case, the middle ground and far distance are sort of overcrowded with high peaks. And I have a question for you. Can you find the human figures here? Well, you have to watch Professor James Cahill's videos for those details. So anyhow, this is Mount Guanglu. It is immense nature somewhere in there, and their idea is this nature is not contaminated. It is not invaded by the nomads, and it is a resting place or peaceful place that these Chinese intellectuals want to reside in. And Jing Hao wrote a little book, and he said, because it's a art critic, he said, a good painting or a great painting must have the 6 essentials. So what are those 6 essentials? Spirit. This is what you call as a qi in Chinese characters, like a qi. It's named as a qi. Like everybody had a spirit, and then the rhythm, and then thought, then scenery and brushwork, like the refined brushwork, and then ink. Ink means more like gradations, right? The tones of black and highlight, those of things. And brush, what he meant by brush is more like a descriptive lines, right? Like something you draw with your brush. So out of these 6 spirit, what would be most important? Well, obvious, number 1, the spirit. So this type of art criticism or the value system perplexed many non-Chinese audiences. Like when you look at the painting in European tradition, you want to see something like picturesque. Do you know the word picturesque? It looks like a photographic landscape. It's so realistic that, wow, it looks exactly like a Grand Canyon, right? You want to have that kind of sensation. But that is what is called the scenery, number 4. It's more like an imitation kind of thing. And that is only number 4, not in earlier part. In Chinese history, Chinese painting, Jing Hao said the spirit. So if you apply this aesthetic judgment or value system, obviously literature painters' works will be considered much better than the works by professional painters. And in the beginning, most monumental paintings were painted on silk because it's more durable and stretchable. So that is northern style monumental landscape. So mountains in the north, above the Yellow River, above the Yangtze River all the way, along the Yellow River. The mountains were, as I mentioned, it is pointed, right? And then it is high and cliff, and it has rocks. and then trees like this, evergreen trees like pine trees, those things, a little bit of water. Do you see the cascades here? And if you come to the southern landscape, this is typical southern landscape you are going to see. I scanned from a book, so that's why you have these grains, the lines, diagonal lines there. But if you watch Professor James Cale's video, you are going to see that original silk fabrics. But in south, you are going to have this type of landscape. Instead of having a vertical silk panel, you are going to have a horizontal silk panel. So the story goes from here and it proceeds to the left. And this is attributed to Dongyuan. Dongyuan meaning it's not the original. It is a very realistic copy of the original 10th century painting. Dongyuan is considered a pioneer or founder of southern monumental landscape style. So it's monumental, but it is monumental wide, expansive instead of high. These are mountains along the Yangtze River. So a little bit flow, the wide river, and then mountains are not that high or pointed, and trees are usually, how do you call it, suitable for mild climate. There are many autumn leaves, a little bit, and then you don't have many pine trees in the southern Yangtze River Valley. And do you see people here? And they are riding a boat here, right? They are working together to catch fish with a large fish net. Some people are waiting, another boat here. So you have some people. On the southern monumental landscape, it is, the field or the center of this movement is Nanjing. And then usually they used their brushwork with round tips. And then later on, an art critic, Shua, said, Dongyuan was skilled in painting the mists of autumn and far open views, that his pictures were meant to be seen at a distance because their brushwork was very rough and loose and wet technique and mist-filled river and country. So what it says is the northern landscape brushes are pretty sharp, almost like a sharpened pencil type of, really sharp lines. But in the Dongyuan style southern landscape, things are more like a watercolor, right? Like a brush with a lot of ink, and then they are sort of spread well to create the sense of mist. There are contrasting features. So what do you think of this? She downing, fisherman on a mound stream, like a sort of northern style, right? So monumental landscape developed from the 5 dynasties shortly before, like 900, 920s. So 5 dynasties is started, and then it became a main genre of painting during the Song dynasty. Here you have the northern part, like a Kaifeng, right? Like the sceneries along these northern part versus later on, if they come to Hangzhou, there are a lot of lakes, especially this lake, and then the river, so the scenery becomes different. Song Dynasty, after the Song Dynasty, there is another great painter called Fang Quan. So his painting is called Traveling Amid the Mountains and Gorges. So is this northern style painting or southern style monumental painting? Northern landscape, right? And if you come to Fang Quan, you can now see clearly that 3-level composition. So you have a foreground, and then in between the foreground and then the middle ground is sort of abstracted or abbreviated by the mist. And then what do you see? The distant mountains, high and tall over there. So you have a foreground, you have a middle ground, and then you have what? Distant views, right? And how large this is? Just like a Jinghao, it's like a 6 feet, over 6 feet, painted on silk. And it has a little bit of ink and color, but you don't see any colors, like a variety of colors. Mainly looks like shades of black or gray, right? And this is how they make the waterfall. You color the empty area, and then you leave the little thin strip to denote the waterfall itself. And do you see human figures? If you watched Professor James Cahill's, you probably knew where human figure was. Now, during the during the Song Dynasty, I want to show you then how this landscape was used. And this is what you can see in this painting called Night Entertainment of Han Shizai. Han Shizai is the man, as you see in this picture, or in here, or here, or here. So the same man depicted several times. Anyhow, he is the man of culture, Han Shizai. So he invited his friends over, and then he listened to the music, for example, or he listened to the different kind of music and drums. On another day, he listened to good stories and women musicians. And then another day, he looked at a beautiful painting. So he really enjoyed culture, right? But originally it's a long hand scroll, meaning it goes continuously from one end to the next. But much later, they mounted it like this. So these are the details, right? But in this picture, can you find the monumental landscape? Point out. I want you to take a look carefully. Behind the seated man's, right? Behind the seated man's, they have some sort of screen, right? And what is painted on? As you can see, landscape. As you can see here, it's a horizontal, a landscape, or another landscape. Or if you see differently, so there is no wall, right? Usually you can hang it on the wall, but you mount it along with the furniture here, like a long hand scroll mounted with the furniture. Or the vertical format, instead of hanging it, they created sort of a divider, room divider, like a screen with wooden stand. So you have a two wooden stand, and then you can put it in, inside this stand. Or if you see back of it, as you can see here, painting is shown in the room, and then you don't see anything outside. So you can have like a 3-layer system around existing daybed. Or here you can see massive landscape, or like a tree painting right here, and then right here. So that's the point. I mean, you can also refer to their fashion of the time. These are official dress for government employees. Like some are musicians and some are high rank, government officials. This is like a observation. So somebody regretted not being able to see Han's famous parties with his own eyes. So he sent his court painter Gu Dongzhong as a detective to Han's night entertainments, instructing him to recreate everything he saw there based on his memory. So the painting, The Night Entertainment of Han Shizai, was then made and presented to the throne. So that's the story. The emperor himself wanted to see. There is a poem, A Night Banquet, so I'm going to read it. The long hairpins, a pair of dragonflies, in her dangling locks, where the green fields end and hills slant, painted screens open. The curly whiskered duke's son and guests of the 5 marquises in one round down 1,000 cups, like rain from the roof tiles. Phoenix throated, the beauties sing seamlessly with a perfection. Brows contrast, Xian river mist, sleeves are whirling snow. So I want you to imagine what the night banquet was like. So endless songs, right, like pouring drinks, and then long white sleeves